evening and welcome. I'm Scott Murray, a recently retired general practitioner and emeritus professor of palliative care in the community at Edinburgh University. It is my pleasure to introduce this very timely Holyrood seminar on assisted suicide. This evening, we have two eminent speakers who will initially each take 20 to 25 minutes to share their particular wisdom and expert insights. So our first speaker this evening is Tanni Grey Thompson. She is an independent crossbench peer in the House of Lords. She speaks clearly on a range of issues, including disability rights, welfare reform, and of course, sport. As one of Britain's greatest Paralympic athletes, Tanni amassed a remarkable medal haul over 16 years and 5 Paralympic Games of 11 gold, 4 silver, and a bronze. Tanni, can I invite you to unmute your microphone and switch on your camera? We are looking forward to listening to what you have to say. You are most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, and good evening, everyone, and thanking you for inviting me to be here tonight. Assisted suicide is not an easy topic to debate, and on the surface, it seems really simple. We hear words like dignity and compassion, and the proposed law is simple to explain. The Westminster bill that I've been working on has been described as a modest bill, that someone with a settled wish, with a terminal illness, with the approval of 2 doctors, will be able to end their life. And it's often portrayed as a Hollywood-style death, where you slip away peacefully with your family and friends around you at a time of your choosing before unbearable pain takes over. I have to say, death is not a pleasant thing to think about. You know, what happens afterwards? How will it happen? But I'm concerned because there have been many reports in the media recently about the law change quoting terrible deaths. And I worry that the reporting can only serve to scare people more into thinking that this is the only option they have. There is a responsibility on all sides to report clearly. And the narrative is being pushed that people are being forced to kill themselves in horrific circumstances, so a change in the law will help. Well, first of all, some of those stories are decades old, but claims that hundreds of terminally ill people died by suicide are at odds with a statement last February by Professor Ian Diamond, the national statistician, and that's the Office of National Statistics. You know, they don't collect data on this. So legalization of assisted dying has resulted in a rise in other suicides, and that could be for many reasons. But what is clear is that legislation does not reduce other suicides. I'm not a religious person. I'm not taking a moral stance, but I do not believe there can be adequate safeguards to protect vulnerable people. And I'm worried about how this will fundamentally change our relationship with those around us. Now, 30 years ago, I would have approved of assisted suicide. And in that time, I've watched several close family members die. The words of compassion and dignity were words that drew me in. They're not words that just one side can claim. So when I joined the Lords in 2010, I knew this was something that I was going to be working on, and spent a lot of time digging beneath the surface and spoken to a range of people with different views. And I've been told we should just vote through the principle and the rest can be worked out later. But the devil is in the detail. Every assisted dying legislation in the world has been relaxed and expanded in its criteria over time, including Oregon. And once the door is open, it keeps opening. And I've been told that I want people to suffer by not voting for it. But I'm concerned for the people who will suffer by voting for it. So if we look at the case of Oregon, for some people, the cooling off period, which is often talked about, has been removed. What I do know is there are no quick sound bites to put my side of the argument. There is a lot of data to go through. In one study, 3/4 of those with wish to die report being lonely, and 60% had a clinical depression. The wish to die is strongly influenced by the perception of being a burden. And some felt 53% of assisted deaths in Oregon in 2020 were about being a burden. And in the UK, loneliness is strongly associated with long-lasting depressive symptoms. And it's such a simple thing to say that coercion wouldn't happen because of the safeguards. Those safeguards in the legislation that I've seen have not been clearly articulated. 1 in 6 older people suffer abuse, including financial and psychological manipulation. And yet doctors have no skill or training in detecting coercion and manipulation. Anyone who's worked on domestic abuse legislation can attest to that. And we also have to remember, where there's a will, there's a relative. Claims that many disabled people support assisted suicide is also incorrect. Only 4% of disability rights organisations have expressed support for this, while 12 disabled people's organisations have actively come out against legislation in the last year. And those people who've been asked, there's little information on what their impairment is or how their daily lives are currently affected. My views come about partly because of the way I'm treated as a disabled woman. I'm treated 3 very distinct ways. One as a Paralympian, one as a parliamentarian, and the third as a disabled woman. I have a very privileged life, but I can't get on a train on my own in the UK until 2070. Half the disabled people who are able to work are actually in work. And under coronavirus legislation, social care has been put under huge pressure. And I've also been told, if my life was like yours, I would kill myself. I have a really privileged life as a disabled person. So when people are asked the question, do you want a pain-free death? Of course, people will say yes. But 42% of the public in one survey thought assisted dying was about refusing treatment, something that's already legally protected. 10% thought it was hospice care, and only 43% understood about giving lethal drugs to end life. And palliative care currently in the UK is a postcode lottery. In 2017, Hospice UK estimated that 118,000 people have been unable to access the specialist palliative care they desperately needed. So when we hear about a settled wish, there are so many questions that need to be answered. How will it be decided? What's the process? How much money will be spent on making the assessment? So although a small minority of practicing UK doctors agreed with legislation, 48% versus 41%, a much larger majority, 47% versus 34%, would refuse to take part. And the decision by the BMA to go neutral went through with a tiny majority of 3, just 3, at a meeting of delegates. In Canada and Oregon, only approximately 2% of doctors are involved. In Colorado, 1 in 1,000 doctors prescribe assisted suicide drugs. I mentioned several legislators have reduced or removed their cooling off period. And in an article for The Telegraph, former president of the Royal College of Psychiatrics, Baroness Sheila Hollins, voiced concern that proposals to license doctors to supply lethal drugs failed to take into account the complex process involved in assessing a patient's mental capacity. She said of the state of US Oregon, where less than 3% of cases were referred for a formal psychiatric assessment, she said researchers have found that some patients have ended their lives under the terms of Oregon's assisted suicide law have been suffering from clinical depression. In Canada, there's little information on adherence to eligibility of standards. Official reports claim that 82% have palliative care, but in most of these cases, that is less than 1 month of palliative care. No information whether this was a single nurse or a specialist palliative care team. And only 15% of people in Canada have access to publicly funded palliative care. So you can see why people make these decisions. In Oregon, in 2012, 66% of hospices do not allow staff to take part. And in New Zealand, all but 1 hospice have refused to take part. But some of the challenges is that Oregon destroyed their source records 1 year after the death. So retrospective studies are impossible. In Belgium and the Netherlands, up to half of assisted deaths go unreported. So it's hard to find details. It's just not possible to say there is no coercion. So if we look at terminal illness, in Canada, they no longer require a patient to be terminally ill. In Oregon, where the patients take the drugs home with them, records show that patients kill themselves up to 1,009 days after the first request for lethal drugs. That is almost 3 years. That's not compatible with 6 months left to live. And doctors, as much as I've had amazing doctors in my life, they're not great at estimating the prognosis. especially in non-cancer patients. And what we're told is that a person has to do it for themselves. What if they fit the criteria, not able to take the drugs themselves? Surely, if they're helped or supported, that becomes euthanasia. So we're told that 2 doctors will be part of the process, but no legislative body monitors the doctors before the decision is taken, before the person ends their life. Any cases that are examined rely on the doctor's self-reporting, and such systems make it impossible to exclude bias, discrimination, errors, or coercion. And what we know from Victoria, Australia, is that as doctors are really struggling to do the assessments. So the next question is, will forms just be pre-signed and the process just push through once the first year or so has been taken through? What I know is that making a decision on assisted suicide requires a dispassionate legal decision. The very compassion of doctors and their inability to detect coercion or predict prognoses makes them poor decision makers. So we're constantly told there is no slippery slope. Well, in Canada, it widened very, very quickly. Their assisted deaths have increased by 36% in 1 year, accounting for 2.4% of all deaths. In Quebec, assisted deaths account for 1 in 25 of all deaths in only 5 years. We know palliative care didn't want it in Canada. Now, if they don't support it, they're defunded. So the MAID legislation has grown 8-fold in 5 years. And Canada now is 22nd in their end-of-life care rankings, down 11 places since 2015. I mentioned about the lack of access to funded palliative care. Now less than half the deaths have seen a specialist palliative care team. I also mentioned about Oregon and the collection of data. And so it requires Oregon Health Authority to collect information about the patients and physicians who participate in the Act, and they publish an annual report. These annual reports are available on the government website. The data isn't collected in a way that helps us understand the level of abuse. In Oregon in 1998, there were 24 prescriptions written and 16 assisted suicide deaths. By 2014, these numbers had risen to 155 and 105 respectively. This is a 545% increase in prescriptions and a 556% increase in assisted suicide in 15 years. The number of assisted suicide deaths in Washington State increased by 43% in 2013. So how did this translate to Scotland? Well, there are 5.5 million people in Scotland, and that's data from 2019. In Oregon, they have 4.2 million people. So if we extrapolate the figures over, 245 assisted suicide deaths in 2020 would equate to 321 in Scotland alone. If Scotland followed Canada, that number would be in the thousands. So I mentioned a little bit about why people choose to do it, and unbearable pain is often the narrative that's used. In reality, the fear of pain is a far greater issue. It's been claimed that 17 people a day die in pain in the UK. Putting that aside, this was based on a theoretical calculation. And even if it were true, it's not surprising when 118,000 people a year fail to get the specialist palliative care that they need. Oregon data shows that those citing inadequate pain control or concern about it constitute 31.4% of cases overall. Things like loss of autonomy, less able to engage in activities, and loss of dignity are also included very high up in why people choose this. The fact that almost a third of patients dying under the Act in Oregon report inadequate pain control or concerns about pain show that palliative care provision in Oregon is unsatisfactory. And surely there's a stronger argument to improve palliative care than bringing a law on assisted suicide. In Washington, 2013, 61% of people who opted for assisted suicide gave the fear of being a burden to their family, relatives, or caregivers. 13% cited financial implications of treatment. That is certainly not a terminal condition. And those figures were much higher in Oregon. The Lancet published a long-awaited for meta-analysis study, which indicated that in 2010 in the Netherlands, 23% of all euthanasia deaths were not reported. In Belgium, 48% of assisted deaths are not reported. So the figures show that there's a great deal of complication, and it's not as simple or as easy as we might be led to believe. And the one subject which now is really difficult to talk about, and we haven't had a debate on it, and I really think this is important, is understanding the drugs that would be used if this law came into effect. I'm not an expert, but I've spoken to a large number of experts in this field. So it's often called medicine, and the assumption is made that there's an easily prescribed drug that consistently brings about death quickly and painlessly. Evidence from jurisdictions where assisted suicide is legal, however, reveals that prescribing such medication is not simple. Actually, I don't like it. I think it should be called drugs because it makes it sound far too nice. No assisted suicide drug or method has been approved by any regulatory authority. Oregon is on its fourth drug cocktail in 7 years, and they acknowledge this has caused complications in 6.9% and in 2012 and 14.8% of deaths in 2015. They also admit the cocktails have resulted in more prolonged deaths. This is dangerous experimentation without any ethical safeguards, monitoring, or oversight. And it's not one pill that just helps you slip away. A reasonable amount of the drugs need to be taken. Ingesting the necessary amount of barbiturates, between 9 and 15 grams, which is considered the lethal dose, can pose a significant and often distressing challenge. The resulting mixture is so potent and bitter that patients may take or have to take antiemetics prior to ingestion in order to prevent vomiting. This is not the Holyrood death that we're being told it is. Annual complication rates in Oregon have been as high as 14.8%. Since its legalization, 33 patients have had difficulty swallowing or have regurgitated the medication. 3 patients have experienced seizures, and 16 patients have experienced other complications. And a total of 8 people have even regained consciousness after ingesting the lethal drugs. Notably, data regarding assisted suicide complications is largely unavailable. But doctors in the US have faced another issue in terms of being able to get hold of the drugs. In December 2011, the European Commission expanded its regulation on products used for capital punishment and torture to include some of these drugs. So the availability of phenobarbital and secobarbital has become increasingly scarce. The price has become prohibitive. A dose that in 2009 cost $200 is now costing something like $3,000. And I think something we have to seriously challenge is the misnomer that I've heard from so many people. Well, assisted suicide already exists. My doctor gave my grandmother a bit of morphine and it all went away. This is not the reality of what it's like. We also know from looking at data that time to death can be highly unpredictable. Again, Oregon, it can go from a minute to 4 days, and other data has shown increasingly prolonged deaths. And in 2020, among patients where there was available data, time from ingestion to death ranged from 6 minutes to 8 hours. And some of the figures show that it goes up to 47 hours. This is not the slipping away that we're told it's going to be. And in Canada, they actually have within their guidelines that if the assisted suicide doesn't happen within a period of time, that actually individuals can step in and move to euthanasia, which again, I don't think has been made clear in some of the reports we see around that. So if a patient takes too long to die, 2 hours is the recommendation. then somebody steps in. Instances of conversion from orally administered assisted suicide to euthanasia, they're not uncommon. And in 2018, of the made cases in Canada with available data, 50% were unsuccessful by 60 minutes and then transitioned to euthanasia. So it's the data. I realize I'm throwing a huge amount of data and figures at individuals, but I think it is really important that we have the opportunity to discuss these things. The other thing we hear a lot of as well, we can let our pets suffer. You know, we love our animals. We treat our pets more kindly than we do our relatives. But we also have to understand that, you know, this is why standard veterinarian practice is never to use oral drugs for euthanizing animals. The efficacy of oral administered drugs for the purpose of killing is viewed so lowly among scientists that veterinarians don't even recommend it as a way of killing a sick pet. Thank you very much for your time today. I realise I'm right on my limit of 20 minutes. But thank you very much for listening, and I really look forward to the questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanni. Thanks so much for such a detailed and insightful presentation. We really appreciate your willingness to stay and answer questions after our next speaker.